Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Sir George, I'd like to begin every Petitions Committee debate, this one, as I've begun every Petitions Committee debate I have led, by going over the prayer of this petition before I'd like to make just a few observations. So formally, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 327108, entitled Reform the Gender Recognition Act. The prayer of this petition states, and I quote, "Reform the GRA to allow transgender people to self-identify without the need for a medical diagnosis, to streamline the administrative process, and to allow non-binary identities to be legally recognised." The response gathered from government showed strong support for this reform, with 70% in favour, but the result seems to have been largely ignored by policymakers. The current process is distressing and often humiliating for transgender people. As well as lengthy and costly, it makes it inaccessible to many people. Reform is needed to improve the lives of trans people, and I don't think that the proposed measures will negatively impact existing provisions under the Equalities Act. The petition closed with 137,271 signatures, including 224 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. Now, Sir George, I do have a speech to make about the specific asks within the petition, but I did just want to make a few remarks before I do, because there is no denying that this petition, and indeed this debate, has been followed with great interest across the country, as indeed has the issue of trans rights more widely. The debate is one that has raged not just in this country, but across much of the world, and sadly, it has not been conducted in a well-mannered or a well-reasoned way. The discussion around trans people has become so toxic that it is frightening people from engaging with it. And indeed, when the Petitions Committee tried to schedule this debate, it was actually quite difficult to find a member who would agree to take it on for fear of what might happen on social media should they do so. To an outsider looking in, it may look like the debate around trans issues is one where you can only have one of two quite extreme points of view. And we've seen the most appalling, dreadful things said on both sides of this debate, with threats, intimidation and venom spat at either side. And there has been a failure to conduct this in a civilised and respectful way. And I want to be very clear that I believe that this failure lands squarely at our doors. It's the failure of MPs, it's the failure of leaders, it's the failure of the media, it's the failure of academia and beyond to make space for a respectful, real and genuine discussion. I will.
Doesn't you agree with me that one of the reasons why MPs are afraid to engage in this debate is because if they, as I have done so, they receive death threats, and in my case, a threat of corrective rape from a member of my own party?
Yeah. I do completely agree with the Honourable Lady, and just to continue the remarks I was making, we have failed to make a genuine space to express concerns and come to an understanding with one another. And this has left a vacuum, because in that space, where with a few people making their voices heard are those who want to pull us into one of two very extreme positions, we are left with only one of two options if you want to engage with this debate. Either it seems you must agree that to be trans isn't right or even real, that trans people are inherently dangerous and need curing rather than support, or on the other side, using trans people as an example of why the entire Western liberal system is wrong and that no one can be truly equal until the very foundations of what we understand about society are broken down. And the failure to have a real discussion has consequences for us all. We now have a situation where people do fear speaking up and fear to ask questions in case they get attacked or targeted. And there are, of course, strongly held views on both sides. But to shut down debate and to say that every single person must agree with our own worldview or else is damaging to society and poisons the debate. Because one of the most common things I hear from colleagues in this place, and I'm sure colleagues would agree with me on this, that the majority of colleagues I speak to simply say to me that they just don't know enough about the issue. They've not really given much thought to the reform of the Gender Recognition Act before. As far as they know, they've never met a trans person in their life, and that's fine. That's completely fine, but it therefore falls on us when we're bringing these discussions to a national platform to allow space for that discussion to happen so we can explore and ask questions. I would gladly give way.
As us in this room as legislators, would you not agree that particularly when we're talking about some of the most marginalised people in society, that we have a job to educate ourselves? In the actual fact, we've had 5 years to educate ourselves.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I do agree. I think I'm going to come on to some points that she probably was leading me towards, so I'll make a bit of progress if colleagues will allow me. If we allow this toxicity to continue and we refuse to lead from the front, we will end up in the situation that we are in now, with having ridiculous public conversations about erasing language or trying to figure out if some certain words are offensive, and labelling anyone who expresses concerns about the protection of sex-based rights as TERFs or transphobic, rather than actually talking about the issues. We abdicate our responsibility as a House. But most importantly, what we forget, if we allow that to continue, are the people in the middle of all of this, are the hundreds of thousands of trans people living within the UK today who, like the majority of us, just want to live their lives. They don't want to have this massive toxic debate going on about their existence. They just want to be able to live their lives. So I plead with colleagues here today, and I urge them to use this debate today as an opportunity to change that narrative. Let's lead from the front. Let's have a more respectful discussion and debate with one another and explore these issues without the need to rip each other's throats out. Because I know from looking around the room today that there are very strongly held views on both sides of this discussion. And colleagues will no doubt want to reference and focus on appalling things that have been said and done on both sides of this debate and talk about some of the more nasty and absurd parts of the far ends of this debate. But I urge colleagues to just take a moment. People would say that this House is at its best when we come together in total agreement on an issue and we get this thing done. But I'd like to go a bit further. I genuinely believe that this House can demonstrate its strength, and indeed the very strength of the democratic process, when we can come together on an issue where there isn't agreement and yet find space to talk about that respectfully and find a way forward. I think that really does demonstrate the best of what this House can do, and I hope today we can have that opportunity, because we don't do ourselves any favours in taking the easy road and just appealing to those that we think are shouting the loudest. So please, colleagues, join me in rejecting this almost Twitterisation of this debate, where our arguments are condensed down to miniature sound bites, and we can really try and find the answers and find a way forward together, rather than tearing each other apart. I would happily give way, yeah.
An important, thank you for giving way, an important argument to frame the nature of the debate. But would you also agree that sometimes it's important that we don't talk in big grand narratives of our political beliefs one way or another? This debate is very specifically about the GRA and the process of applying and getting a GRC. And so actually colleagues shouldn't be having these big grand debates about trans, feminism, etc. We should be talking about the practical thing that the GRA and GRC does, which is only two very practical things, nothing else. It doesn't give you the rights for all other things, it only gives you two things it changes, your birth certificate and pension rights. And therefore we should limit the debate here on that, and that will provide civility.
The Honourable Member has second-guessed what I'm about to just move on to, so that I thank him for that intervention. Because I truly do believe that there is a way forward for this House to come together on this. Because as a member of the Women and Equality Select Committee, which conducted a very recent inquiry on reform of the GRA, I was actually very struck at how much agreement there was on both sides of the debate on many of the practical issues that this petition is calling for. And a repetition of the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town, specifically on the issue of the application process for a GRC. And after all, that is what this petition is all about, because much of the discussion has indeed centred around access to things like single-sex spaces. But those, of course, aren't catered for in the GRA, nor indeed included in the scope of this petition. They are instead governed by the Equality Act, which sets out provisions around single-sex spaces. But it is quite right that we also do make space for that discussion to happen, because indeed part of the reason the debate has become so toxic is because of the confusion around the application of the Equality Act and its relationship with the GRA. I will do.
Can I just disagree with him on there being no impact on the single-sex provisions in the Equality Act? There is a respectable body of opinion that there will be an impact on the single-sex provisions in the Equality Act. And of course, we're waiting for guidance to come out from the EHRC. Does he agree with me that that guidance is much needed and will bring some clarity to the debate?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I do actually agree on the point of guidance, and I come on to this point next, in that it is the failure of subsequent governments since 2004 and 2010 to produce any guidance about the relationship between the GRA and the Equality Act and the exemptions that are provided for within it that have led to a very disjointed application of those exemptions in much of public life. You have those that use it to exclude absolutely everyone, you have those that use it to exclude absolutely no one, and a large majority in the middle that simply do not know what to do because there is no guidance available from the centre as to what best practice looks like. So I would urge the government to look again at the Committee for Women and Equality Select Committee recommendation in order to produce that guidance and indeed convene an advisory panel of those on both sides of the debate as to what that guidance could look like and bring it before the House so that we can debate it and discuss it. But I want to go back to focusing specifically on the application process for a gender recognition certificate as catered for within this petition. In the Select Committee inquiry, we received evidence from those who were in favour of further reform and those who were against it. But what really struck me was how much agreement there was between the two sides on the actual application process itself. Indeed, the three big asks of reform of the GRC application process were more or less welcomed universally. So I would strongly hope that the government can have a chance to look at these in a bit more detail. I will happily give way.
I thank him for giving way, and I absolutely agree. We need to have a civilised discussion about this. But given the difficulties and given that it is clear that the Act as it currently stands provides huge problems for people, for transgender people, does he agree that we actually need a reform of the Act?
Absolutely. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that intervention. And I think there is a case, there is a strong case made simply because if you look at the statistics around GRCs in particular to show that the process obviously doesn't really work. The fact that only 1 to 3% of trans people actually go through the process of obtaining a GRC, I think demonstrates to me that the process is indeed too bureaucratic, it's too expensive for many, and it simply isn't fit for purpose. So I will give way on that point.
I hear the point he makes, but isn't it also the case that we ought to consider whether GRCs actually fulfil any useful purpose? Because the GRA was introduced in 2004 at a time when we didn't have same-sex marriage. We now do. So what is the point of a GRC?
I think the point of a gender recognition certificate is the difficulty that trans people have in getting their legal gender recognised by very many bodies. I think that is why reform of the GRA to allow for an easier process to attain a GRC is needed. We may need to come on to a discussion later about whether or not GRCs are actually fit for purpose in their entirety, and I would absolutely welcome that discussion. But I think what we've been left with at the moment with these two bits of legislation, I think the first step would be a reform of the GRA to get us to this point, and then we can look forward to the future. Now, the changes that were recommended in the government's consultation in 2018 and in the two Women and Equality Select Committee inquiries focus around three particular asks. The first of which is the removal of the requirement to obtain a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before applying for a gender recognition certificate, as well as removing the need to provide medical reports detailing all treatment that people have undertaken, which again was something that both sides of the debate throughout the Select Committee inquiry agreed with. The 2018 government consultation showed that 64% of people agreed with removing the need for a diagnosis and 80% supported the need to remove detailed medical reporting. The second requirement, the second ask is the removal of the spousal veto, which requires that a married trans person must obtain consent from their spouse before getting their legal gender recognised. And again, there was agreement on both sides of this in the Select Committee inquiry, and 85% of consultation respondents agreed that it should be scrapped. And finally, there was the call to remove the need for trans people to provide evidence that they have lived in their so-called acquired gender for 2 years prior to obtaining a GRC. Now, this was condemned very strongly by both sides because it was felt that this reinforces gender stereotypes, and there was no agreement on how to define or how to prove that you have lived as a man or a woman for 2 years before obtaining legal recognition of your gender. And again, nearly 80% of people that took part in the government's consultation agreed that that should be removed. So instead of having to collate all this information and submit it to the Gender Recognition Panel, which I'll just note anecdotally from the evidence that we received was very, very confusing because there doesn't seem to be any accountability as to who sits on that panel or how it operates. The call is instead for a form of Registrar General to be introduced in England and Wales, before whom trans people would have to make a legal declaration to an official in order to obtain a gender recognition certificate and legal recognition of their gender. And that would, of course, come with consequences in law for any false declarations being made. This would therefore not allow people to self-identify without an application to an official. And I think the phrase self-identify has been one that has been very confused and potentially is very unhelpful because it does conjure up images, I admit, to those from the outside who would think that, does that mean that you can just wake up one day and decide that you're going to change your gender? Well, that isn't what the petition is calling for. And of course, I don't think anyone here would really recommend that either. This model that I have outlined has been one that has already been introduced in a number of countries: Argentina, Brazil, Ireland, Denmark, Norway, France, Portugal, Greece, Iceland, Luxembourg and Malta, 4 provinces of Canada, 10 states in the United States, and is being introduced in New Zealand and Germany. I think Ireland is probably the closest example we have, and the Irish model is reported to have worked particularly well, and is probably closest to what some campaigners have been asking for. So there is a lot of agreement, Sir George, about reform of the application process to obtain a GRC. So I do hope that the government can take this away to look again, and that colleagues here and those who haven't taken part in this debate, but I know would have liked to come back together and realise that politics is a battle for hearts and minds, but we don't need to be at each other's throats to talk about it. There are, of course, strongly held views and indeed a temptation to steer the conversation into areas that aren't necessarily directly relevant to the GRC. We have to appreciate that trans people do indeed face huge challenges in the country today, not least of which recognition of their gender, but also the violent and sexual crimes to which they are subjected to. They're twice as likely as other LGBT plus people to be subjected to conversion therapy, for example, and face discrimination in their everyday lives. But we must also understand that there is reasonable and understandable concern, particularly, for example, from women about the protection of sex-based rights, which comes very reasonably from an unacceptably high level of physical and sexual violence towards women, which of course creates concerns about erosions of those rights. And we must therefore allow the space and the time for everyone to be legitimately heard and find a way forward. Because change is a slow process. I know that's really frustrating to hear, particularly in the social media age that we live in at the moment, where we demand instant gratification and instant action. But the real world and the battle for hearts and minds I have found in my short time in this House to be infinitely more complex. And we have a duty, I think, to lead from the front in order to remove the toxicity out of the debate, because I don't believe that continuing with that will end well. It will just push people further into one of 2 directions, or leave them afraid to say anything or fear to act at all. So I do urge colleagues, if they would be willing to hear me, to join with me today to try and take the toxicity out of this debate, and let this be the moment that we come together to do more and express the real and genuine concerns held on both sides, so that we can work towards what everyone wants, which is a society where the rights of all are respected, and indeed what you get out of the country is what you're willing to put in. So let us try and be the leaders that the country needs on this issue right now, and calm this debate down, work together across the divide to find the answers and find the way forward. Thank you.
The question is that